The next steps for secondary cities. We really do want to have this be an interactive discussion and have you voice your thoughts about how the symposium has gone, the things you've learned here, the things we've talked about. I'd like to set the stage a little bit and have, I don't know where that went. We were going to put up Phil's table because I thought that really creates a nice context in which to have this discussion and think about how we can operationalize some of the ideas we've heard about, some of the limitations, challenges that we're talking about. And I think the day has really set the stage for this moment. We've talked about, we've looked generally at what secondary cities are and their data needs and the needs for this kind of mapping activity. We had a number of case studies that we looked at and trying to figure out how those case studies can inform in terms of lessons learned. And then we had the series of rolling discussions or rolling presentations right now that talked about very specific issues, anything from looking at the need for humanitarian aid approaches, the kinds of data that's needed for that, and what really needs to happen in terms of that people part of our equation. We looked at the national data infrastructure for India, a really comprehensive description of what's going on there, and then an explicit example of looking at data collection for data needs in Accra. So with that as the context now, I'm going to ask my colleagues here to consider the table behind them, and this is a cold question, right? right here, and really think about how you might respond to that table there, and have them each sort of respond to that, and then let's open it up for a discussion.
Maybe Phil can review.
And Phil, if you wanted to make a few comments about the context for your matrix, it might be helpful, but you're going to need the microphone wherever it... Oh.
Thank you. So this table, what I'm trying to capture with this is obviously we're talking about here is data, how to collect the data for secondary cities, and how to do dynamic mapping of the data sets for the secondary cities. But in this process, it has to be driven by some kind of application. So let's take the one that Lee proposed. Let's put 2 shoes under everybody's feet. So that means we need to understand who needs that at different places. So that is the application we have over there. And this really becomes, we need to find out or identify the poverty places around the globe, and also where are they located in terms of the village, and what is the transportation and other data infrastructure that is needed, so that we could have the tool to show where are those people and where do we have the show makers. I'm just using that as an example, so that could drive us to develop new tools from the computing side or software side to facilitate matching between the show makers and who needs that, and also based on some kind of pricing and co-location to match that. But in order to come up with these kind of systems, when we go to talk to the, for example, the countries in Africa or South America in the small villages who need those, we need some kind of mindset or thinking about how do we communicate with them. And yeah.
So since this is your construct, you put it on at the end of your talk,
yeah.
And I didn't actually quite get it. Maybe, maybe you can provide an example of what would intersect in that matrix so that others can think about it.
Right, yeah. So in that process, I was just using your example about putting the shoes on the, make sure that everyone get the shoes. And in fact, this is one big movement in China, is that they're trying to get everybody out of the poverty stage. So there's a term over there they use, precision, kind of precision identify who needs that kind of help, and then they go to help them. And so I was using probably similar to that. So in this process, we need to think about, that's one example. And if we go from the secondary cities in terms of, okay, after, let's say, 5 years later, how are we going to have the data for secondary cities? So that could facilitate the future applications, like this one we're talking about, solving the poverty problems. So that means we need the data. Obviously, we hope that a lot of data sets could be collected. And then we need the infrastructure to manage those, and we need the sustainability of the data and the infrastructure. And eventually, we hope that all the secondary cities in the developing countries could have those smart services as proposed or talked about now in the smart city movement. So in each of these stages, we need some kind of application to drive that, and also the software tools, as we heard about today, a lot of tools we talked about. And also, we need to change our mindset from the past. We need to talk among different cultures and think from the geographic or spatial temporal perspective. So this table is really to link by saying, for example, in order to handle the big data sets in the 5 years from now, from the computing side in that cell, what kind of challenges or problems we need to solve. In order to support the application, let's say smart citizen services, and then what kind of application we need to develop, and what is the challenge of developing that kind of applications.
So I'm a little confused, Phil. So are these all innovations, it sounds like? In which case then the bottom row doesn't belong in this matrix, because what you're talking about are innovations that need to take place at the intersection of those?
That's right. I was just trying to emphasize the innovation here, which means we need some kind of disruptive or some kind of new technologies. So we can take that out. Just look at the previous three: the thinking, computing, and applications.
But we don't necessarily know what's going to fill those intersections because they haven't been innovated.
Right. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
All right. I just want to give an opportunity to flesh that out a little bit, because you put it on at the end of your presentation and it looked intriguing to me. I just couldn't figure out why.
In fact, I have the same question, so that's why I think we need help from everyone in the room.
All right, thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to just ask for comments from the panel.
Well, this looks like in a military or intelligence antecedent, what's called a TO&E chart, basically a table of equipment and almost like an order of battle for data collection. And I think the key thing to start with is before data is two missing columns, which is populations and purposes. But basically, that's where it needs to start. And so we're looking at, this is important to use as a frame for discussion because it has an opportunity to put the needs first. On the side, I would add formats. That I think the critical thing we hadn't talked about before is interoperability, and I'm sure it's come up throughout, but also as we talk about the ethics issues with populations and purposes, data minimization. From a technical perspective, what I spend a lot of time thinking about is right now we're in a maximalization posture. And when we're beginning with a new technology, we always will be in maximalization, right? Because we don't necessarily know what the key heuristics are for certain permutations. But as we professionalize and we standardize, we know we're doing that because we can become more and more minimal in what we collect and why across needs permutations to populations for purposes. And so I think minimalization is a frame helps us begin to think about, okay, what do we need to get to minimalization? And that is a canary, a positive, an inverse canary in the coal mine that tells us we're on the right track.
Okay. There's a lot of different aspects. I have to think in the context of the work that we were doing in Accra, one thing that I think is one of the biggest challenges, there's two related challenges. One is we had a survey team that was funded. They could go in and ride on these buses. And so we were able to come up with a comprehensive system of data. One of the challenges is going to be the continued collection of it. So how do you design systems so that the information that exists now can be updated? There's a variation in the routes. There's all kinds of different variation that I never got a chance to speak about. But in the routes that actually get run from these terminals, for example, that is dependent upon the choice of the drivers, and they can choose which route they want to take under different circumstances. If there's congestion on one, they might choose to take another one, for example. And so these questions of trying to get a sense of what the overall transit system looks like and how it is evolving over time is a huge challenge, especially because it needs to come domestically. It has to come from there. It needs to be collected from there. So I think there are lots of different. I'm not sure how that's going to happen, but I think that's one of the main challenges of going into the future, is ensuring that it's possible for information to be collected on a continual basis. And I don't really have an answer for that, and I think that we're in a period, I was discussing this with Nathaniel beforehand, we're in a period of tremendous, tremendous experimentation. Every day there's some kind of new tool, and one of the amazing things about this conference actually is the number of different tools that have very similar inspirations, let's say, that exist and that are all coming alive around the same time. And it's difficult to know where it's all going to go. And I think it's more likely to be an emergent phenomenon than it is our ability in this room to say, here are the technologies that are going to work in the future, and here's how we're going to get there. They tell me that in Vermont, they say that it's hard saying not knowing. And I feel like that's the state we're in now. We maybe can think about having general enough, and this is something that Melinda, I know, was also speaking about, general enough structures to allow many different things to emerge. But I think it in the end will become emergent. One last little thing is, I think the key to the success of being able to harness this type of information, and I think eventually, not for the key to the success, but I think what will drive it probably are incentives for people to provide the information correctly. And so I think of Waze. Does anyone here know Waze? Yeah, everyone knows Waze. So that's, to me, a classic example of the potential for big data and the potential to crowdsource accurate big data.
Yeah. So this is an interesting discussion. I think one of the central questions in my research is always about the process. So whenever there are, these processes of data generation, data production, data collection, analysis, mapping, etc., and the systems are implemented and so on, I always have the need to examine it critically and scrutinize the various aspects, because we also then need to ask, and then what? How does it resonate? Especially what are the goals? In these cases of secondary cities mapping, there is a direct goal of changing, proactively using it by the people to make changes, and those are very big goals. Now, all the data and technologies, we can really jazz it up, but if they're not properly used, it doesn't really come to much. And I think what I showed you from the e-governance model, certainly it doesn't lack for investment, doesn't lack for mapping and it's very ambitious, and the way it's being planned, I mean, I'm amazed. But what are the impacts, especially with regards to citizen participation? And it's very interesting that India connected the GIS mapping and analysis and all of that directly with citizen participation. That's an explicit goal in all of its official discourse. So coming at it from the policy perspective, if that's the goal, then we have to then understand what's the nature of participation, what are the obstacles, and do these questions and do these improvements automatically translate into more, citizen control? And obviously it didn't. Where in fact it made a difference was having more direct community-based, action research. And that's because of the structures of participation. I don't remember who it was, but somebody said that citizens, I think Mark, citizens shouldn't have to do this, right? And I think that's very true. Citizens shouldn't have to map, citizens shouldn't have to fight for the basic rights. And it should be the responsibility of the state. More and more we see the states abdicating that responsibility, whether it's in the US, whether it's in the other countries, and really adopting this neoliberal framework. So it's ironic to me that India's adopted this whole e-governance model, and its governance model is the adaptation of a neoliberal framework which emphasizes public-private partnership. And there are some interesting Indian twists to that, because in part the public agencies, the citizens themselves wish that they would be more like private sector, because private sector is far more responsive than the government is to customer complaints, say. But at the same time, the structures remain inflexible. So if we have to always, in these endeavors, examine it, go dig deep. I think Melinda said drilling into that, and really examining processes and its various sort of intended and unintended efforts, and also making a strong effort to collect input from the ground up. That what are the outcomes of these efforts, right? Did the data, did the smart city movement, or did any of these things, did the e-governance movement, did these make a difference? And again, from the examining the Indian case, I can say that that's not where the government has paid attention to. It's not measuring the impacts. That's a big problem. So anyways, I think that if we can expand our attentions to not only generating data and generating new technologies, which I'm all for, I love all of that as much as any of you, but also how it's used and what actual impacts is it making, and what are the challenges, things that, people are not, tend to gloss over, the issues of linguistic disparities. GIS, I find the GIS implementation process from the West to the global South, really interesting, because one can translate it to a new form of colonial activity. Are we not imposing a Western system? Yes, the Indians themselves are implementing it. But very interestingly, in any of these discussions, the agencies are not mentioning languages at all, whereas that was a primary discussion post-independence. That's why thematic mapping at vernacular languages was considered so important. And the fact that that doesn't come up as much, not only within these specific countries, but also amongst the work. A lot of times I see projects happening in this place, and then there's reports, but they're not mentioning the cultural factors. How are people responding to maps? Do they have map reading skills? How do they respond? How do you include non-English speakers? what happens when GISs, I mean, all these GISs are always in English. How does that translate into different languages and cultures? And these are very hard questions. And then, of course, there's issues of semantic interoperability. And this, I mean, I look forward to talking to Keith about this in particular, but dirt roads can be translated into so many different ways semantically in Indian languages. And it's based on local cultures and how the way they phrase it, right? So then how are these barriers to be encountered? And so it's a huge project. And I hope that there's some creative work in translating GIS from this sort of monolithic system where, okay, this is the layout, this is the thing, this is the structure, this is the language, and then that gets implemented everywhere, to it actually being shaped by local cultures and languages and local innovations. It shouldn't be a one-way process of the West transferring its knowledge to the East. And it worries me a bit when I see that, right? So I hope that it's a two-way process, that it is interactive and dynamic in a different sense, and that the countries and the culture, the people take ownership. When we keep talking about people taking ownership, and I think people taking ownership is a bigger question, taking ownership of creating the GIS as well, right? We also did some, with one of my PhD students, we looked at China's urban mapping and GIS work and so on, and how it's used in governance as well. So it's interesting. But again, the question is that, what is, first of all, the medium? Is it always remaining English? How does that translate into local cultures and practices? And particularly, I mean, in the case of India, if you're going to target citizens as a key word from the get-go, are they thinking of mapping cultures, map reading skills? Well, English reading skills is that big elephant in the room right there. So it's a very complex thing. And I hope that we as a community of scholars and practitioners address those layers of complexity. Thanks.
Thanks for all those comments. I really appreciate them. I have just a couple comments. I want to open it up for questions from the audience. I think that if we consider this matrix within this context, there's a couple of things to think about. I think that this should be place-specific. I don't think that this matrix is universal in terms that it will cover every single way of looking at one place and be able to look at multiple places and have this be the way to do it. So I think you would use the matrix and maybe work through it for the different cities that you might be working in, or their different locations. So I would think about it being place-based. The other thing I think to consider in terms of looking at these kinds of projects is and I think we've touched upon this, the whole social production of these things, that it's grounded in our societal practices and how we view each other and how we view the places we live in, and we can't ignore that. We've talked about class, we've talked about a number of ways that we differentiate across our different societies, and so how do we actually really operationalize that and be able to recognize that as one of the impediments to what we want to do, but also as one of the benefits to what we want to do, because we can learn from each other by creating new cultures from the technologies that we're adopting and utilizing. The very real things that I think we have to contend with is any projects like these demand time. Who has time? It's not a rhetorical question. Who has time? You guys have time? Nobody has time. Oh, okay. And the other one is money, right? Where's your funding to support something like this? Where do those dollars come from? So, I mean, those are the real impediments that we run up against in terms of trying to do good work and trying to do exciting work and trying to do the things we want to do. And so I think trying to step outside the box and think of new methods. I love matrices like this. I think they're so exciting. My students just hate it when I say, make me a matrix. But I think these are really good tools for really trying to extract some interesting ideas out of and trying to mix it up and think about it a little bit differently. So with that as kind of a context and the comments from our panel, I invite your questions and comments.
Thank you very much for everyone's comments. I have one sort of targeted question for Mr. Raymond. In fact, when looking at this matrix, everyone commented on it, I think, in their own way. It's the column on sustainability, and I'm kind of interested in looking at or hearing your opinions and approaches when we are talking about humanitarian response, or when we're talking about conflict-affected populations and conflict-affected countries, at what point on the vertical side of it, and I think in thinking, do we start to think about things like rebuilding and reconstruction and how we expand the definition of the needs from one that is immediate humanitarian action to one that is a bit more longer range. I'm interested in hearing about any experience you have with that or any thoughts and approaches to that question.
So I had a call 48 hours ago at some ungodly hour in the morning with a colleague in Europe, and we're trying to figure out how to construct case studies about capturing not the deployment by institutions and governments of ICT or data collection or remote sensing, but to capture organic occurring uses of ICTs and aid provision or development actions that happen during conflict, looking actually at Kosovo, at Libya, at Yemen, to try to see how there is organic stimulation of tech and particular mapping that's causing economic development and service provision during armed conflict in civil society. And we spent a good 45 minutes of that call just trying to come up with vocabulary, okay? Because we think in a bilateral donor approach, an institutional approach, and to my colleague, in terms of the C word, what could be called sometimes a colonial, projected approach. And so I have this photo on my computer I look at all the time as a reminder, which is from the Vanity Fair article a few weeks ago called The WhatsApp Migration. And there's a picture of a man coming out of the Mediterranean, and he has two things, his child and a pink plastic bag. And in the pink plastic bag is his phone. The two things he could carry, it was his smartphone and the child. And I think about how much we don't know about how to study that. We have two scientific gaps, two sciences, social sciences we don't have yet. One is that, first of all, the teleethnography, to my colleague's point. The teleethnography, especially telecommunication or geospatial gender studies. We are engaged in interventions now that have impacts on women, such as dumping cell phones off the back of a truck at Dadaab camp with a population of women who are treated as property. And suddenly you assume this ambient protective effect by, technology, remote sensing, mapping, democratizing, protective, like it's objective and magical, when in fact you're entering a cultural environment that you don't have a science for even understanding. So one is this teleethnography and gender studies, because the World Bank reporting on the relationship between internet access and economic advancement or economic status change is throwing on our head many of these assumptions. We don't know what's causing what. Okay, so to keep it succinct, second point here is what's the science of causal impact about a ICT intervention or geospatial intervention, how do we know what's causal and what's correlative when we deploy this in an environment, or it is generated by the environment organically? How do we understand that? And it's not just going to be the tech people, and it's not just going to be the social scientists. It's that we got to have an innovation baby between these sciences to have a social science that without it, we can't design these interventions or understand how they're occurring. Right now, that's the need. So go figure that out.
Hi. Something that you all kind of said in different pieces brought an idea in my head that I hadn't had before, which was I'm reading this book called The Powers of Maps by Dennis Wood. Really great book about just how maps work and at a very deep level. And one of the things that he says is that the kind of difference between the society that we live in and some of the societies that you've been talking about is that we use a lot more maps than they do. And kind of a defining characteristic of a advanced technological society is lots of maps, and kind of the more maps you use, in his estimation, the more, I mean, he's guardedly using the word advanced, and I think we can leave aside the colonial implications of that for a moment, but just when you think about how many maps we use on a daily basis, I mean, I've used 6 of them today, and how few maps people that are in these places use, it's kind of extraordinary, and it just made me sort of think that secondary cities by definition are places where people are using more maps than they used before, and that you're going into this, so rather than going in and having this big divide between us who use all these maps and then these kind of poorer people or otherwise underprivileged people who don't have access to lots of maps, but they're in the process of becoming more map literate. And I just wanted to share that thought with you, that this idea that the places that we're talking about are places that are on a kind of more map literate map trajectory could be an interesting thing to think about.
I think there's work to be done related also to the question that Rina brought up in designing of maps that don't necessarily require you to speak English or to read any other language. Yeah.
Well, I'm familiar with Dennis's work, and actually just a month ago I was in a symposium with him, and however, I mean, again, the cultural differences get a little lost. Let me just say, was the output of our discussion. And the point is that there has to be very nuanced level of development of GIS software too. And I mean, I'm a user of various types of GIS, including open source and so on. And I see very little innovative thought going into interface designs, into the way the terminologies are used. Even so that even in this so-called map literate society of America, not everybody can understand GIS at all. And certainly marginalized communities in the US don't understand the ways GIS interface is.
I don't understand GIS.
Yeah, well,
I don't mean GIS, I mean maps.
Yeah, but if you're looking into where do you go find maps? Most of the time the maps are on the computers residing somewhere. If you're looking for local level detailed maps, where are you looking? You're looking at the city halls, their GIS service and their maps and stuff. So in any case, what I'm saying is these various software, they need to look into perspectives from different communities. They really need to go beyond this, monolithic user group with the assumption that everybody, kind of maybe can follow the terminologies or mapping practices and so on, and really start thinking outside the box and be more inclusive of social spatial divides here and how people respond accordingly and elsewhere. I mean, with other cultures, it's even more complicated. And perhaps for the other cultures, I mean, the efforts need to come up from those countries. They need to be more in charge and stop being customers all the time. And I say that as a critic of India's approach. That why? I mean, then what's going on in Bangalore, right? Why aren't we creating our own GIS?
May I jump in and mix it up a little? I want to throw a provocation out, okay? And so let's shake the snow globe here and see what happens. So 3 data points, just and to get people's reaction. Data point 1 is an incredible Pew study in the past year that found, going back to what I was talking about Katrina and Biloxi and cell phone usage. Okay, fast forward 11 years. Suddenly, lower income minority communities in the United States have the highest smartphone adoption. And in fact, are highly app literate in ways that blow the socks out of our models about, quote, poor people and technology. Why is it? It's their primary means of accessing the internet because they can't afford a PC or a tablet. And so they're doing what higher income populations do off of this device. Okay, so I want to throw that out as provocation 1, is that we are seeing to quote Stephen Jay Gould, the paleontologist, a type of punctuated equilibrium in phone use and adaption by socioeconomic populations in ways that can be surprising. So I just want to throw that out and say, how do we think about that? Because our assumptions are far older than what the data is suggesting. And then the second thing, saying mapping is empowerment, mapping as naming, mapping as counter-naming for communities, mapping as claiming. Okay, think about what's happening with the Dayak now and the UAVs in Indonesia. They just won a court case to protect their forests based on their deployment of GIS and UAVs. And so now we have liberation geography occurring. and as much as we have taking of space, we have people claiming space. The third thing, and then I will shut up, I'm just trying to roll some bombs into the room, is the third thing is to look at the issue of how we give names to places, and now increasingly we're giving names to demographics within places that are projected. And they are now giving names to themselves and doing mapping, which expresses priorities, naming, and presentation of place, which counters often centuries of projected narrative. These are the 3 things. Assumptions about tech use and adoption, sometimes massively wrong in ways we can't predict. Second, people are taking GIS in many cases to claim space. And third is we are seeing this renaming, this radical renaming occurring in some places in ways that we don't know how to document yet. Thoughts? Discuss.
So Nathaniel, funny you should mention that my research is about public participation GIS, which works with marginalized groups. Yep. And does exactly that. The problem, though, is that much of this kinds of data and technology is still residing in these desktops and so on. And it's not in cell phones or whatever. And so, I agree with you that cell phone usage, that's an area of development we should look at because that's far more usable to most people, and it can also do it can bridge the digital divide more. Certainly in developing countries, that's been a huge explosion, mm-hmm. right, and afforded new opportunities. But at the same time, because so much spatial data resides in certain formats and is available through in certain platforms, that's where the issue is, and that's where people encounter difficulties.
Yeah, the discussion is fascinating. I just wanted to mention one thing that I think I haven't heard yet in the program so far, but in my humble opinion might be relevant, which is gazetteer building. It ties to the table that we just had on the screen a moment ago, data and infrastructure supporting that data. What do we need to do in the computing and the application level to provide that. And I think that for mapping, particularly citizen-driven mapping, like for secondary cities, a lot of the participants may not have the professional GIS training, which we shouldn't expect, probably wouldn't be able to provide either. But they have the local knowledge. And to tie that local knowledge to a functionable database and use it in a sustainable way, the gazetteer probably is the link that could fill in the gap between the standards and their local knowledge. But then Melinda just raised that challenge. Who has the time and money, right, to do things like that? Let alone, we don't have enough time and money to teach people to gather data on the field. Everybody understands that's important. How many would say, oh, building a gazetteer backend nobody sees and very few understand also worth our time and money, and it's important. So a lot of the issues, you see the impact immediately on the field, and a lot of the important pieces that was on the chart probably isn't visible to a lot of people, but nonetheless is equally important too. So I just wanted to point that out.
Okay, thank you for those comments. We're going to kind of bring this to a close now. I know that some people have to be on their way, and we asked Lee to give some closing comments. I want to first thank the panel for your discussion and comments. And with that, I'll turn it over.
I'm not Sandy Pentland. I don't pretend to be. He was on the program but couldn't make closing comments, so I'm filling in for him. And what I've done basically is I jotted down a series of questions or challenges that were brought up. If I can get it up here, maximizing it. What am I looking for here? How do I get it maximized?
Slide it lower right.
Ah. Do this. All right, I'm failing in technology here. I could just do this.
Yep.
That's it. View. Oh, there we go.
Full screen reading.
Full screen. All right. Nah. What the hell? Everybody can read. So a number of questions that were brought up during the course of the few days. I said you can stay here. You can also leave if it's awkward to look up there. I just realized that. I'm trying to bring this back to the Secondary Cities project because that was the reason we had this meeting, and it's a project that my office is sponsoring. So I wanted to remind people that these projects are by definition community defined. They are by definition focused on the language of choice of the communities, including a non-English language, if that is a desire. Many of the communities actually want the project to be in English. That still doesn't get over the challenge of the terminology that hasn't been developed in the local languages. And they're all based on this triad of what we call islands of stability, if you will: local government, universities, NGOs, civil sector, private society, and that all. But this project really requires the participation of all of that triad in order to work, because of the vagaries of political change, because of the challenges of funding requirements that differ. because of the budget of discrepancies between local and state and federal sources. So if we have the buy-in from different sectors of society, we think the projects have a greater chance of sustaining. We need a champion, really, to ensure the sustainability. That's also built into each one of these projects. So one of the biggest challenges, and I'm going to go through these kind of one by one, and if people have some comments briefly to make, or some ideas or some best practices or examples they can share, then we're going to jot them down and take it from there. One of the challenges is, how do we translate our language and our messages to decision makers? We have a hard enough time talking among ourselves, and just magnify that tenfold if we're trying to translate this into a community that doesn't understand anything about our science or our terminology. And that's a critical question if we're talking about generating funding for these projects, generating government support. So we need a better way to translate this message, and a lot of that has to do with visualization and presenting the results of the analysis of our data. If we cannot do an effective job of doing that, then it doesn't matter how strong and robust are the data sets that we've collected. We fail because we haven't been able to present it and translate that well into decision makers. So visualization versus analysis, ideally both. We need to do a better job. Anybody have any examples or suggestions of an effective way that you've done that with your own work, with translating this into opportunities to get funding, with publishing something in a popular journal that translates well to people? Yeah, Keith.
I showed an animation I made 20 years ago. Just showing that at a professional conference and giving the press release got more feedback for my project than anything else. We ran it on 5 television channels and so on. Great.
Yeah, I think slider technology is one of the most visually compelling way to show the power of data. You can, as opposed to spreadsheets and links and everything, if you can really show on a map change over time, that's a good way to translate our message. Fernando, did you have a? All right, so I'm going to make this available to people here. We're going to make these questions available and send them out. And Faith is writing a few things down, and we'll try to generate it afterwards. And if you don't have an opportunity now to kick in, you can later.
Yeah, so with respect to visualization and analysis, one of the areas, especially with respect to cities, is how do we deal with three-dimensionality of the city, the built environment and the like. And there's a variety of approaches. Some emphasize visualization, some emphasize more the analysis. So you can get very excellent, beautiful 3D visualizations that are nice to look at and do things with, and they don't support analysis. They don't tell you what the building's used for. They don't tell you what it's constructed of. They don't tell you its material properties, that kind of stuff. Whereas you can have other models that support that kind of analysis and urban planning and other types of disaster planning or what have you.
So that gets to the combining remote with in situ observations.
Yes, sir.
We need to do a better job of that simultaneously, I think.
That and the formats then in which, and the data models and the encodings in which gets back to Melinda's question about the interoperability and formats and protocols.
Okay. High tech versus low tech, apps versus no apps, data processing and the challenges of large data sets and how is that done effectively, efficiently, low cost. Disconnected versus headquarters analysis, how best to embrace opportunities for the use of social media. I mean, these are things I raised because we've heard opposite sides of each one of these brought up today. We want apps, we don't want apps. We want widgets, we don't want widgets. We want social media, we can't make use of social media. So how do, if anybody has an idea on strong ideas on one way or another that haven't been expressed today, we welcome them. My view is that, much like Melinda was saying, I think a lot of what, again, getting back to the parochial view of our project, a lot of what we're doing is dependent on the locality we're working in and the people we're working with and the needs of the communities we're working in. If we're working in a community with a high cell phone penetration and use, then we may be able to use social media more effectively than what Keith was talking about, where you have only 2% global, penetration. So Just general thoughts on that. If anybody has anything that they want to raise now, please do. Yeah, Tyler.
As far as like data processing and disconnected environments, our team has a project we call it Fog Machine. It's like a cloud on the ground. It wasn't my name, but someone's like, oh, fog, it's a cloud of phones. But it's using mesh networking with iOS devices and distributing processing. We've got right now an example that uses, you can use up to 8 phones. That's protocol limited to do viewshed processing across multiple devices, but really looking for a problem that would lend itself well to those types of things, dividing the work up between different devices. So if anyone's got any problems that might be good for that, or it might be faster to handle something on more phones than one, definitely be interested to talk about that. And yeah, offline, our team also does a lot of stuff as far as like offline storing of data. So if anyone's got any questions, concerns, comments about that kind of stuff, if I don't know the answer, we've got some good folks on our team that could answer questions about that.
Great. Thank you. Yes, Tiffany?
I think being flexible and using all types based on what's available, integrating high tech with low tech, and having a very integrative approach. Also having qualitative and quantitative data.
So I think
having both a mixed method approach and in both ways, a mixed technology approach and a mixed method approach, and integrating qualitative data with quantitative. With that regards, I wanted to also respond to some methods, which I wanted to talk about that earlier, but I forgot. There are many different qualitative GIS methods to capture qualitative knowledge, and that should definitely be part of such vision planning, such as sketch mapping, such as, of course, mental mapping. So there's also qualitative GIS packages. So really integrating qualitative GIS into the practice.
Good. I think we didn't emphasize enough the qualitative GIS aspects of particularly human geography to understand societies better. Tiffany, you had a...
Yeah, just really quick, I think for that point, just make sure we're all using the same acceptable standard of data, and making sure that if everybody agrees to one standard way of making their data available, it'll be available on the low side and the high side and anywhere else. So I think we can pretty easily do that and make sure we're all on board on that one.
Good, thank you. Getting back to a couple of comments that Sandy Pentland made about the need to map behavior. A lot of the data he was getting, admittedly, were sort of behind firewalls or behind areas that are accessible to most populations. Can anybody think of the types of behavior that are sort of low-hanging fruit that would be available in almost any community that we're missing, that we could consider as sort of a baseline for our foundation layer here, but that's human geography and not infrastructure or structural? Just a thought that I throw out. Keith?
Probably the most common transaction everybody makes every day is buying something, and that's usually with credit cards. But point of purchase information, which is currently closed and only available to the credit card companies and to the big retailers and the grocery stores. If that were more public, I think it would be vastly interesting.
Yeah, I don't consider that low-hanging fruit, though. That's the problem. That is not available because it's held. So maybe
I've seen it. Some European studies using that kind of data. So I wonder if something could be done here.
All right, interesting challenge. Yes, up there.
You said not about infrastructure, but I do see that happening in infrastructure. In Montreal, for example, the city has an open data policy, and it means an awful lot of data is becoming open. And we have a project, we're going to run one of these smartphone surveys in the fall, and it will be anonymized, but that will become open. And then there's also smart card data, which in some places is also becoming open. So, and the smart card data, really, you can start to get interesting information.
Yeah,
behavior
I think that's
as well.
still largely in the European context mostly, or?
Yeah,
Yeah, I just add a question and a suggestion. When I look at this list of questions, these are great. I'm thinking about, could we come up some kind of roadmap for dynamic mapping for secondary cities? And this list of questions definitely is a great start. I don't know if we have the chance to go over everyone in the room, but could we put this on the Google Drive, like make it a live document and send it to everyone so we can input to this?
We can certainly share it with this group. Again, each project is designed according to its needs, but if we could come up with some general recommendations as to best practices, I think that would be very useful.
So we saw this yesterday and today, multiple examples of map production software, map exposing software, GeoNode and Esri and a variety of projects that do that. We didn't see, what Sandy's presentation captured, which was the geospatial analytics side. And there are lots of good open source and proprietary source projects that are addressed, certainly at analytics and even more so getting into geoanalytics. Some of the Apache big data stuff in particular is real relevant that could be an area to move to for dynamic mapping for sure.
Right. Melinda, you want to mention something about that? I know that's an abiding interest of yours. Right now our projects haven't generated the amount of data that would support analytics, but maybe you have a comment on that, because I know it's a big push of yours.
Not really.
Okay, it's a big push. It's a big push of Melba's.
Phil hit it a little bit with some of his tools that he has.
We have some infrastructure that could be utilized to support this project, and it's not.
Right. Yeah. All right. I thought another thing Sandy said that was very interesting was bring the algorithms to the data. I like to use the word algorithm, even though I don't really know what one is, but I like to say it, so I just repeated it there. But I think the key part of that is he said you don't have to share the data itself, and that I think is what everybody recognizes, that the mistake in a lot of these projects is sucking up information as opposed to knowing where and when to get the information. So I think that's something that we can perhaps all agree upon, that knowing how to access information, knowing the standards you want to use, knowing the metadata you want to use, and the rigor in quality control, quality assurance is more important than trying to make sure that every project has all the data all the time. Any comments on that? And that the data are available, are shared, and can be stored in a manner that allow it to be shared. Wendy?
Well, I have the mic, so that's a convenience. This is to follow up with what Keith's suggestion. I have actually a real example of using commerce data in understanding population behavior and income in Brazil. We had once, a few years back, a visiting scholar had worked. He was an employee in Brazil's major energy company. So he had that access to the data, and he was using the company's database to map the household income in some of the cities in Brazil. So I think that, if we were to go into other countries and trying to gather information, perhaps negotiating with some of their major commerce or suppliers, it might give us a shortcut to some of the data.
And I think that's been some of the successes of the projects we've done so far. I know Kristen's project has discovered a lot of data that we never would have had access to if it weren't for the project, and the project in Kharkiv did the same. The challenge of that is sometimes you can use data that will help for analysis, but you can't make the data available and share it, and that's sort of a philosophical problem we have with the project. We would like to be able to use that data to make stronger analysis, but it's against the the philosophical underpinnings of open data. So that's something we always have to try to balance in these projects as well. So far, we haven't run into a problem with it because before we agree to a project, the partners agree that all the data used and discovered in the project will be open and available to everyone.
I was just going to make a comment about that, as well as bringing the algorithms to the data. And when I first heard that, I really kind of liked that idea. I thought, oh, good idea that we don't have to worry about sharing this data and we can aggregate it and use it in some way. But then I think that also has us go down that rabbit hole where we're not being as transparent about what we might be doing with the data, and we lock things up in a black box. And we do that a lot now with our technologies. And I don't think particularly students, young people, citizens are understanding some of the machinations that go on behind that black box and what actually happens to the data. So how do we keep track of that and make sure that we're analyzing and utilizing the data appropriately and correctly, which is always open for discussion?
There was just around the low-hanging fruit data issue or question. I read a study that some German academics analyzed pictures of cows on Google Maps and of deer, basically any sort of photograph of ungulates in a field, and discovered that they have a orientation towards magnetic north and south.
Yeah, I saw it.
And you know, the amazing thing there is not that, I mean, it's not like people hadn't been looking at cows for a long time, you know, like, but they just never noticed this before. And I feel like the low-hanging fruit is all around us. I mean, it's less about sort of identifying a data set that you can, and it's more about like identifying data sets in the kind of wash of incredible material about the world that's all around us.
One of the very first symposia we put on for the Worldwide Human Geography Data Working Group that I co-chair was about data-poor regions. And one of the presenters said there's no such thing as a data-poor region, just regions about which we don't know enough. And that's along the same lines, I think.
I was going to say, I like the algorithm idea as well. And I'm looking at not just, I get it that the communities that you're working with have agreed to share data and they want this, but there's also might be national data and possibly census data from that country that is sensitive. And I know we've had trouble getting that sensitive data out from the country level. So possibly we could broker some sort of a deal where we say, we'll come in and derive this much information from your census, because it is very valuable information. So possibly there's cases like that sort of algorithm case or approach could work, so that we're not actually going in and actually taking the data and pulling it and putting it somewhere else and sharing it, but we're just deriving what we need from that information. That way we're getting more of the national level data or other sets.
Yeah. I think we've already done that. We have to stick to our philosophical guns, but at the same time, if all partners involved agree to the use of some data, I agree there are some possibilities of using some data that may not be made available to make other data better, or to make relations with that other data better. All right. I think the next bit here, more technology or less technology, I think that's been answered in part by the use of both high and low technology, and the previous panel spoke about the importance of interoperability. These are sort of, I think, basic tenets of any GIS that work is being done on. Collaboration and competition is something we deal with all the time. I'm just curious how you all may have viewed this. I think when we have a public-private partnership as part of our project or as part of any project, that in some ways diminishes some of the competition, but in some ways increases it if we're working with a particular private entity that has a vested interest or a particular tool or software that they want to promote rather than another one. I think all of the partners we have that have joined us in this meeting are very collaborative, and Most of them have offered a lot of free services and support. But any pearls of wisdom in terms of how to work the competition among developers or vendors or universities are not non-competitive places, as we all know as well? Phil?
Just a thought on this. We have different organizations developing. Just a thought on this. We have different organizations developing software and use solutions or develop solutions.
By we, you mean who?
Everyone here in the room.
Okay.
So is it possible to make that solution or tool open at least to the community? So if one project develop a tool that can be used by another project, and it's not kind of, okay, this is my tool and I'm not going to share that. I don't know at which level, either open source or at least without license constraints within the secondary cities project.
Yeah, I don't think we're at the stage where we're developing tools. I think we're implementing tools. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, what solutions?
I'd just like to suggest that collaboration and competition could be used effectively in the worlds of VGI. We've already seen collaboration in the mapping parties, the pizza after the walking the neighborhood. That's a very effective way to gain new data. But also, geocaching has taught us that you can use competition very effectively to gather new data in a volunteered geographic environment.
Yeah, I have something later on in this that talks about incentives. I consider that more in the area of incentives than competition in the sense that I meant it here. Mel?
I guess just the comment I was going to make is I think just from doing these projects, we're learning that there are actually new tools we need, and that there's things that we can do to that there's things we need to do to address some of the problems that we're facing. So something that's come out of this meeting is I've had conversations with a couple of people about a particular issue we're contending with, and we're going to have a smaller discussion and meeting to solve that problem, and from that may become a solution as well as a tool that will come out of that. So
the next paragraph, what constitutes authoritative data? This is particularly important, I think, in terms of quality control and quality assurance. I have strong thoughts about authoritative data. And in the context of our project, authoritative data are the data that are created by our communities that are mapping themselves. And I think for the context of this project, that is the only authority that I think matters. Other organizations define data by various different authorities, and sometimes you have to accept that authority. But I think I would like to disappear the use of authoritative data for the context of this, as we might not be so happy with that. But I think again, it gets around to my hobby horse about quality data. So it's much more about quality control and quality assurance than about the data being authoritative. Because if it's good data, that's all the authority you need. So I'm kind of on my soapbox here, but
I think authoritative goes back to the idea of the national map accuracy standards and so on. So really we ought to think about quality as being something that we can assess and quantify. And the traditional view is that volunteered geographic data is a lower quality than authoritative data. As we've seen from the Haiti instance and many other instances, that's the reverse is actually the truth. But I just think of, say, Mookie Hackley's group at UCL in London are actually doing quantitative assessments using OpenStreetMap on the accuracy associated with volunteered data. I would suggest that's a very important contribution.
I think we have to start with asking, where does power reside in this? Who's the authority? And does the authority acknowledge the validity of the local data or the community data? Because I agree with you. This is where my sympathies lie. On the other hand, real power is residing in the hands of agencies which may not acknowledge citizen-driven data or community-driven data?
Right, well, that's why in this particular project, the triad that involves local government agreeing to the project, and often we're creating data where data previously did not exist. So there's no legacy data to counter the data that are being created. I think that helps when you don't have competing data sets. There's authoritative or government data and locally generated data. In most of the areas we're working on, there's no data, and then there are new data. And if we get the buy-in from the powers that be, I think it helps deflect that possibility of conflict over control of the data. All right, moving along. All right, we like to say in our human geography group that data need to be usable, useful, and used. That gets to my point where we need to do a better job of communicating the value of the data. Too often, I think we congratulate ourselves for a GIS project. This is very common in the natural disaster world, in my experience, where, as I like to say, we have sort of GIS geeks at headquarters sharing digital products with GIS geeks in the field, and then the feedback comes back that, oh, it was fabulous, we created all these wonderful maps, and then you talk to people who are actually doing the implementation, and they're walking around with paper maps because there's no connectivity and there's no understanding of how to use it, which is kind of what Nathaniel was taking. So we have to be careful about defining success as just a technical or technological result, but the end use and the implementation of the project, I think, and the benefit to the intended community needs to be the measure of our success. Another example I just threw down here was we supported a community-based mapping project done in South Sudan that UNDP was running, where they were trying to help the World Food Program design the route of the Ring Road that was supposed to reach a large part of South Sudan, and there's a new government of South Sudan. They still were trying to construct trunk lines off that road, and the local communities designed a very solid community-based map in terms of where the greatest need was, in terms of market, in terms of access, in terms of housing, and they were talking about what a successful project it was, and I asked, well, where was the road built? And it turns out the road was not built at all where it was recommended, but it was built based on traditional patronage systems that existed within sort of the tribal communities. So we have to be very careful in congratulating ourselves prematurely on these. Again, taking the prerogative of my soapbox. How to incentivize volunteerism? Our project finds that the availability of high-resolution commercial satellite imagery goes an awfully long way. All right? Very important. It's very expensive for a lot of the communities we're working in. They don't have the ability to purchase it themselves. We teach them how to make use of this imagery, and then that can incentivize academic research. It can allow professors to use it with their students. Once somebody gets involved in doing a research project, sometimes those projects can last for years, as many of us know, having gone through the process. And so I think that's one way of incentivizing, I say incentivizing volunteerism. If there are other ways that you all, I'm sure everybody has a different way of providing incentives to communities to map their own environments. So any success stories would be nice to hear now, or can be thought about and sent in when we distribute this digitally. Everybody I know wants to get out, so yeah.
Real quick, competitions and prizes for students?
Yep. Points, credits, things like that?
Yes, I showed a global computing map. In order to incentivize the volunteered computing, we give them credits, which shows, for example, which country contributed how many, and we rank them based on that. The hackathon or something that gives the students or the volunteers some kind of prize, I think that's always helpful.
Yeah, those of you who may know Dave Warner, who had his famous Beer for Data exchange in Afghanistan, which was also very effective. Probably the oldest tried and true incentive. Ethical concerns considered. How are ethical concerns considered in the development of a project? Again, different experiences, I think, would be interesting to hear from all of you, because those concerns vary greatly depending on the communities you're working in. Yes?
I think it's a very tricky question. I've been working it was about 10 years ago, I was a project manager in Iran working on revitalizing a historical town.
Want to wait for a mic?
The focus of the project was about revitalizing a super historical town in central part of Iran. And so I decided to do it very super participatory, engage all of those stakeholders. And after 2 or 3 months, I realized that people want, all the residents of that historical town want to bulldoze their town. So the purpose of the project our goal was to revitalize that town. So developers wanted to destroy that town, and the residents wanted to destroy that town. So in terms of ethical approach to this topic, my main goal was to respond to people's need and desire. But after that, I realized that maybe it's not all about people-centric approach. It's about responding to sustainability needs. I'm personally tired of the term sustainability very much, but I love it. It's about responding to 3 E's of sustainability, of economic development, equity, environment. So I personally, as an urban planner, I personally prefer to build my ethical concerns on responding to sustainability issues. We talked a lot about citizen-centered design and planning or community development. I'm a little bit hesitant about only focusing on citizen-centered design and planning. I think there's a broader concept that we need to look at.
Good. And we haven't had much discussion about surveys. I think surveys can be very useful, I think, in terms of figuring out what it is that communities want. And as geographers, I think, many people in this room probably have strong experience with surveys and the value of geospatial data for helping to conduct surveys. Fernando?
Lee and Melinda, thank you for letting me sit in. It's a great session. I want to encourage the Secondary Cities Project and this community to look at emerging and new data streams that are coming available. My question earlier this afternoon, when I talked about the European series of Sentinel satellites, I forgot to mention the most important part of that program, which is the data is global and the data is open and free. So, and there are other huge opportunities. Let's not be provincial here. The pace of change is amazing in this technology. There's more and more data sets out there. Let's not think that it's only American data that can be brought to bear on this very, very important issue of urbanization. Thank you. Thanks again.
I didn't know there was such thing as American data.
I'm just going to follow up on that. I'll turn this back on.
I was bumbling around here. Just to follow up on that.
By the way, if I may, the links as to where you can access those data sets are easy to find. NASA and USGS have designed new portals to ingest that information. A lot of it is going to be, this stuff is going to come in very, very fast pace. And also there are already European data sets. Well, maybe what we could do is add the links to whatever notes come out of the meeting on this point.
Yeah, so another group that we had invited to this session was the group that's developed Google Earth Engine, and that's just another great way to access a lot of the remotely sensed data that's already been pre-processed and packaged in a way that you can use it very effectively and very efficiently. So that's another area that I think is really, really exciting, and it's just too bad that they couldn't come, but they had one of their big meetings the same time. So it's another area to look for, and we'll add it to the list somewhere when we post things.
Thank you. How to manage mapping change. This is a challenge that kind of caught me by surprise. It was one of these instances where, you know, we congratulated ourselves for doing a job and then created a whole bunch of data and then realized, oh, damn, now we have to look at this data again in a year to see how it's changed. I'm kind of convinced that automated processes will help figure that out, but I haven't had much experience with it myself. So if anybody has examples of this or can point towards some technologies that are being developed that are user-friendly, that will allow this to be done on a systematic basis, that would be great to contribute to this discussion. Tiffany, you had a question from before, I think.
Yeah, I just have my point is actually looking at all three of those last questions. And I know this is a point that you guys have already thought about in the overall scheme of the project. But what I found will hit all of these points is to make sure that we're making a real concerted effort to hand this over to the local community, to make sure we have programs that can continue to make them want to own the program, and then they will be incentivized. They will make changes as changes update. The only way that any of my programs have ever made it overseas is when people have taken it over and gone with it. And I know you guys get that, and most people do. I just want to make that point because it's really the way that this will succeed.
Amen. And the very last point I have on my notes is Habitat 3 is going to be in Quito, Ecuador, October 17 to 20. We hope to feature some of the work of our Secondary Cities project. Kristen Miller from EcoCity Builders will be there demonstrating some of the work they've done in South America. We're going to have a State Department-sponsored event that will show some of the work that we've done. And we may go out to this community to ask for your help or your suggestions in order to make the work we do more valuable, in order to make our demonstration more powerful. So I deputize each one of you in this room here as secondary city deputies, and we have your emails, and we may reach out to you on occasion for your help and to solicit your ideas. And again, I thank everyone for coming today. Any last questions? If not, yes.
Can I just make one final comment?
Yes, you can. I'm not going to make the final comment because that's going to be me. I'm just straightening things out here.
My own final comment, and the rest is yours. I absolutely agree with the local ownership points, and I think that is so important. And I just want to remind us all that talking about the community or the local community or local people often is a euphemism for the educated and privileged people in those communities, and there are many more people often who don't have an opportunity to participate and don't get a voice in whatever local processes due to power dynamics and relationships that people coming from the outside really don't usually understand. So that's just something I hope we'll all keep in mind as we get very excited about the potential of using this technology for the benefit of communities and giving them ownership of it. Thanks.
Well, thank you. That actually should be the last word, because I think that's probably the most important thing that's been said in these past 2 days. So I appreciate it very much. My final word, however, will be, in addition to thanking you all here, to thank again the consortium that we're working with, and Wendy and Harvard CGA for hosting us here. And we will follow up with you and continue to solicit any ideas you have and keep you apprised of our progress as we move forward on this project. So, and Melinda and your team, thank you very much. Faith, one final word from Faith.
You can still have a final word. I just wanted to make sure everybody knew that we are working to set up the symposium. We've recorded everything, and video recorded and audio recorded, the whole symposium. And so we will be making this available. And we're also going to be textualize, transcript, thank you. We're going to put the whole symposium in a transcript as well. And so we'll be making that available somehow, some way. But please just keep your eye out for that, because we are looking to make this available, open to everybody.
Just in case anyone here did not online register for the event, I think most of you did, but just in case if you didn't, please still do so, because then we have your email and we can make announcement to tell you that now the videos are posted online, or now the proceedings are posted online. And also for the speakers, if you had not moved your presentation file on the podium PC and didn't send me a copy, please do. Then we can share your slides with people who couldn't make it to the event here. Nonetheless, I've received requests and saying, "Can I dial in online? Are you live streaming the event?" And say, "Unfortunately not, but we'll post everything afterwards. So please help us make that available." Thanks.
Okay, it's 5 o'clock. Thank you very much.